and for Nathan to mute me.
Sorry.
Thanks. All right, let me welcome you to this edition of Psychedelically Speaking, put on by our crew at the University of Ottawa. I'm going to start with a couple of housekeeping items. The first is the University of Ottawa's inaugural graduate student conference on psychedelics and spirituality will be held on April 5th. You can attend in person or you can take in the talks, which will be live streamed in the same YouTube channel, I believe. With the 2 micro programs and the newly launched M.A. in Psychedelics and Consciousness Studies, as well as a whole host of doctoral students from several interdisciplinary fields, the talks promise to be super interesting. Again, that's Saturday, April 5th, starting, I believe, at 9 a.m. Correct me if I'm wrong. And then also too, because we're having the meeting, April's Psychedelically Speaking talk will be replaced obviously by the conference, but the series will resume in May and it'll continue throughout the summer. The other housekeeping item I just want to let folks know is this lecture is being recorded, so it'll be available for future viewing. Previous lectures, obviously, in the Psychedelically Speaking series are available on the YouTube channel. In the event you would prefer anonymity, this particular lecture is being streamed live on the YouTube channel, and we can put the link in the chat if you want to join that as opposed to being here. If you're not already in the YouTube channel. And then after the presentation, of course, there'll be an opportunity for questions. Those on the YouTube channel can send your questions in directly through that platform. It is being monitored. And for those of you on the Zoom call, you're able to put your questions directly to our speaker yourself. Okay, without further ado, are there any other housekeeping items that we need to cover? Okay, no emergency exit chats. Great, fantastic. So now on to our speaker. So it is a great honor to introduce our speaker today for our Psychedelically Speaking series. Dr. Ariel Fuenzalida is a prof of classics and religious studies and a core faculty in the Psychedelics and Consciousness Studies M.A. program at the University of Ottawa. He also teaches at Carleton University's Department of Sociology and Anthropology. In 2020, the University of Ottawa recognized his excellence and outstanding teaching achievements with an award. So it's no surprise that both universities in Ottawa, where he calls home, are tapping into his expertise. Dr. Fuenzalida's current teaching and research interests focus on speculative psychedelia, biopolitics and the globalization of psychedelics, philosophy of psychedelics, pharmacoanalysis, critical plant and drug studies, and contemporary social theory, among others. His fervor for psychedelics has been evident from very early in his extensive academic career, which includes an internship at Esalen and further studies at the California Institute of Integral Studies, where he rubbed shoulders with the likes of Groff, Shulgin, Metzner, and McKenna, among other greats in the field. Dr. Fuenzalida brings this same passion for ideas and a love of learning to his teaching, aiming to instill critical thinking skills and, in his own words, to help students navigate the complexities of contemporary social life. For the next generation of conscientious thinkers, being on the receiving end of this enthusiasm and passion is a true privilege. And making students aware of these complexities might actually be his superpower. Every lecture is a journey being expertly guided along myriad twists and turns through complexities on a convoluted path that inevitably dives headfirst into the most contentious and thorny issues, or tensions, as he likes to call them, in a manner that draws you in and forces you to wrestle with the inconsistent facets of the beliefs you may have started with. So today's talk on the genealogy of the Psychonaut promises to take us on another incredible adventure. Without further ado, Ariel, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for that super generous introduction, Heather. And thank you to all of you guys that invited me to give a short talk for the great series that you guys have been sponsoring this year. So let me just say like a couple of like just kind of opening remarks. I will absolutely not do justice to the title of the talk in the sense of like I will not be fully actually exploring a genealogical kind of approach to the topic, but I just want to kind of maybe just kind of sketch out a couple of ideas with regards to psychonautics specifically. I'm just going to see if I could share my screen. I'm going to show you guys a couple of quotes that I'm going to be drawing from along the way as I talk. So I hope that is visible. So not a great PowerPoint presentation, by the way, just the super basics. So let me kind of just start kind of unfolding a couple of ideas. So this idea for this talk kind of emerged as I was reading as I was reading a couple of kind of interesting books, most notably, I was reading, sorry about that, I pressed the wrong button, but I was reading Mike Jay's really excellent book, Psychonauts, Drugs and the Making of the Modern Mind, which was published in 2023. And in that particular book, Mike Jay pretty much offers this really compelling history of drug use, and he focuses on drug use specifically of scientists, of philosophers, of writers, and of various artists, and kind of by delving into the histories of drug use. He covers numerous topics. He covers Freud and his use of cocaine. Yeah, he has an entire kind of really interesting chapter on William James and the anesthetic revelation. There's another chapter on cannabis and specifically unfolds around the tales of the hashish eaters and a host of other kind of really interesting chapters. And he pretty much kind of like argues that our modern ideas about the mind pretty much have roots in the practices of drug discovery, and particularly the whole book kind of revolves around the figure of the psychonaut. Um, so today, kind of like instead of kind of repeating such a history, I kind of just really want to briefly kind of sketch out what I like to think of as the kind of the conceptual outlines of the psychonautic tradition, who, at least in my estimation, whose main activity kind of revolves around problems that blow your mind. In philosophy, the term genealogy pretty much refers to this historical method of questioning, and particularly a historical method of questioning the commonly understood appearance of philosophical as well as like social beliefs, such as morality as an example. And I'm particularly here thinking of Nietzsche's genealogical method that he undertakes in the aptly titled book, The Genealogy of Morals. So I totally take inspiration from the genealogical method and kind of hope to really briefly question as well as explore the practice of psychonautics. In this sense, the neologism psychonautics was first proposed by Jonathan Ott way back in 2011 to describe the practice of human self-experimentation with psychotropic drugs. Here I just pulled up a quote from Jonathan Ott, and this is what he says, and I quote him here. He says, "Human use of psychoptic, of or pertaining to mental vision or visionary substances of entheogens, that tending to become divine within from the precise classic Greek substantive entheos, is properly described as psychonautics. In a broader sense, psychonautics could refer to all human use of psychotropic, and in brackets, turning towards the psyche, drugs. It is a subfield of psychopharmacology, and in this case, involving human use of drugs to make trips through the mind, trips with entheogenic psychotropic or visionary drugs." End of quote. So from this quote, it seems that psychonautics is first and foremost a practice or a technique kind of fundamentally linked to tripping, as well as the exploration and navigation of altered or visionary states of consciousness that are occasioned by psychoactive, and these are primarily, psychedelic drugs. The word psychonautics, we should note, is pretty much a modification of a term that was originally introduced by Ernst Jünger. In his classic book, Anaherogen, Drogen and Rausch, which was published in 1970 in English, the English translation is Approaches, Drugs and Inebriation. In that particular text, Jünger pretty much documented the results of decades of research based on self-experiments with a variety of psychotropic substances, including opium, hashish, LSD, psilocybin, mescaline, as well as alcohol. And it was in that text that he coined the term psychonaut. And he coined it specifically to describe someone that undertakes experiments with psychoactive substances, kind of like by reasoning that if an astronaut explores outer space, then the psychonaut sails through so-called inner space. Now, this particular compound term is obviously here composed of the Latin word psyche, which means which comes from the Greek psyche, meaning breath, soul, mind, spirit, or life. The suffix naut is short for nautical. So it comes from the Greek word nautos, meaning sailor. Its root word is nous, meaning ship. Also, according to the Collins English Dictionary, the suffix naut kind of indicates a person engaged in the navigation of a vehicle, especially one used for scientific investigation. Furthermore, this navigator is typically linked to a traveler, specifically a traveler on a trip or some type of journey. Now, depending on the territory that the individual is navigating, the suffix of the word can produce many different types of figures. So, for example, think that the balloonist becomes the aeronaut, or the underwater explorer becomes the aquanaut, and space travelers become astronauts or cosmonauts. So kind of following this type of logic, then, a psychonaut is one who navigates the psyche. In other words, what distinguishes the psychonaut from all of these other nauts is pretty much the vehicle that they use, as well as the territory they're in attempting to traverse. And in this sense, and kind of like in search of knowledge and adventure, the psychonaut seems to be the figure that undertakes various types of exploratory sorties into the so-called far reaches of the psyche, with the intent of discovering as well as mapping its uncharted and wild regions. Now, although the trips they undertake are intensive as well as motionless, they are nevertheless productive of some type of space or territory. So, how did this space or territory emerge? And how can we kind of conceptualize this type of space? We should note here that there are all of these geospatial metaphors and tropes that are invoked by the term psychonaut. And these tropes that are invoked by this term are really central to shaping the way that we think about the psychedelic experience. The classic example here is obviously Aldous Huxley's The Doors of Perception, and most notably his short essay Heaven and Hell. Aldous Huxley here famously described his self-experimentation with mescaline and other psychedelics as a journey to the remote regions or antipodes of the mind. So in the latter text, so in Heaven and Hell, Huxley introduces the trip trope, and he does so by developing a cartographical metaphor of the mind. He says, and I quote him here at length, he says that like the Earth of 100 years ago, our mind still has its darkest Africas, its unmapped Borneos and Amazonian basins. A man consists of what I may call an old world of personal consciousness, and beyond a dividing sea, a series of new worlds. The not too distant Virginias and Carolinas of the personal subconscious and the vegetative soul, the far west of the collective unconscious with its flora of symbols, its tribes of aboriginal archetypes, and across another vaster ocean at the antipodes of everyday consciousness, the world of visionary experience. End of quote. So by kind of juxtaposing so-called imperialist maps and systems of classification onto what he calls the nether regions of the psyche, Huxley pretty much grafts geographical as well as zoological metaphors onto the psychedelic experience. And furthermore, he argues that we have kind of barely begun to explore, to survey, and to map these so-called dark regions. But with the help of psychedelic compounds, he argues that we have found a new and a reliable means of transport. Psychedelic drugs for Huxley are vehicles. And accordingly, the experience of being under the influence of, say, mescaline was pretty much like sailing beyond the horizon. He writes, and I quote him at length again from that same text, he writes, "If you go to New South Wales, you will see marsupials hopping about the countryside. And if you go to the antipodes of the self-conscious mind, you will encounter all sorts of creatures, at least as odd as kangaroos. You do not invent these creatures any more than you invent marsupials. They live their own lives in complete independence. A man cannot control them. All he can do is to go to the mental equivalent of Australia and look around him." End of quote. Now, as kind of like elaborated by Huxley, these, so-called remote regions represent kind of the essential otherness contained within the mind. Moreover, in these dark and unexplored continents of the psyche, there, according to Huxley, there exists, creatures that are at once exceedingly improbable, yet totally open to observation as well as systematic investigation, according to him. More so, he totally says in that text that, at least in relation to the fauna of these regions, he claims that we are not yet zoologists, but rather we are just mere naturalists and collectors of specimens. It is pretty interesting that for Huxley, he seems to be arguing that the primary productive task of the psychonaut is essentially to make a census. And ostensibly, the main activity would be to kind of describe, to map, as well as to report one's encounters and one's experiences when you're venturing through these types of territories. So with Huxley here, the psychonaut kind of fundamentally becomes an explorer as well as a cartographer, while the trip trope that he invents totally encodes the psychedelic experience as a form of travel, as a form of journey. And in doing so, Huxley provided a fundamental discursive framework that would be used and would be elaborated by a whole host of others. Terence McKenna, for example, takes up the trip trope and he pushes its imaginary further. He pretty much opens the invisible landscapes of psychedelia onto the urban populations living in concrete jungles by encapsulating it as a democratic as well as a motionless voyage of discovery. This is what McKenna says that where we could see this link immediately, and I quote him here. He says, "People in the confines of their own apartments are becoming Magellans of the interior world, beginning to map invisible landscapes and to bring back stories of the New World, brought back to Spain at the close of the 15th century. Stories of insect gods, starships, unfathomable wisdom, endless realities." End of quote. Now, these Magellans of the interior world, as McKenna calls them, they totally set sail on psychedelic molecules under the aegis of discovery. And at least like all good travelers, when they return, they bring back a whole host of fantastic tales of otherworldly places, as well as of strange encounters. In this sense, the trip trope invoked by the term psychonaut is really far-reaching, since it fundamentally insinuates that the spaces, the territories that the drug user travels to, that these are objective spaces, that these are territories that are like just waiting there. They're waiting for the traveler to discover them, and they're populated by a whole host of denizens, strange denizens. Now, the assumed kind of objective existence of the psychedelic territory that the term psychonaut kind of carries, this is kind of problematically, both psychologically and ontologically speaking. Now, this trope also situates drug discovery as well as exploration within a colonial discourse, primarily one where drugs are linked to exotic spaces populated by primitive peoples, as well as foreign entities. Now, at this point, it would totally be possible to launch a post-colonial critique of Huxley's trip trope. But I will not do so, at least not in this talk. And what I want to do is I want to kind of follow another line of thought here. I kind of want to like wander down a bit. And I want to wander down by kind of revolving about the like experimental nature of the psychonautic tradition. And I want to kind of like explore a little bit its links to epistemology. I want to use a quote by Jonathan Ott to kind of go down this path. According to Jonathan Ott, again from the same text that I quoted him from before, Jonathan Ott says the following, and I quote him. He says, "We psychonauts are those of the modern world who are most like the experimentalists among traditional shamans. We are lovers of entheognosy and of drugs in general, precisely like the shamans. Even as our shamans, we are natural product scientists, i.e., searchers for truth and viability. Like traditional shamans, we are psychonauts." End of quote. So interestingly here, Ott totally emphasizes the collective we of the psychonaut. And that finds kind of its point of origin, according to Ott, in the traditional shamanic types of traditions. In this sense, the psychonautic tradition is effectively, according to Ott, marked as groups of people that come together as lovers of drug knowledge, as well as seekers of truth. Moreover, due to the, and we should totally acknowledge this, by the way, due to the illicit status of psychedelics, the largely underground practitioners that form all of these dispersed do-it-yourself neurochemical communities, they do not establish a recreational or even type of addictive relation to psychoactive drugs. Instead, this group of psychonauts kind of methodically attempts to cultivate a self-experimental relation to psychotropic drugs, whose intentions are more intellectual, more spiritual, and political than they are hedonistic. In other words here, psychonauts form thought collectives. They form thought collectives that are bound by the experimental desire to explore various types of spaces that are produced by psychoactive compounds. So when speaking of a psychonautic tradition, it should be kind of broadly conceptualized as an experimental assemblage or some type of entanglement between people, psychoactive drugs, psychic territories, cartographic practices, self-experimental protocols, as well as the production of drug knowledge. Now, I want to just kind of really briefly focus on the psychonautic method, primarily because, at least in its modern scientific incarnation, psychonautics is an experimental method in psychopharmacological research and is more technically referred to as a psychonautical bioassay. We should note that a bioassay or a biological assay is a scientific method or a biological procedure for figuring out the concentration as well as the potency of active substances by testing them on living matter. More specifically here, and I quote Panoganti here with regards to this definition. More specifically, and I quote, "A bioassay is defined as estimation or determination of concentration or potency of physical, chemical, or biological agents by means of measuring and comparing the magnitude of a response of a test with that of a standard over a suitable biological system under a standard set of conditions." End of quote. Simply put here, bioassays are experiments. They are experiments involving biological organisms, specifically for the purposes of testing for the toxicity and effects of a chemical substance. Now, when it comes to the exploration of psychoactive substances, the bioassay must be psychonautical in nature. That is, it must be performed on a human mind, and preferably one's own mind. So the so-called tasting and the nibbling of experimental chemical compounds, we should totally note, is considered and has been considered a respectable analytical method in chemistry and has a fairly long scientific history. In this sense, with the rise of modernity, the ancient art of dosages became entangled with the modern scientific apparatus, and it was championed by those attempting to discover the psychopharmacological actions of both naturally occurring as well as novel synthetic compounds. In the late 1890s, the psychonautical bioassay was incredibly crucial in isolating the active molecules from psychoactive plants, cacti, and fungi. Um, for example, in a series of self-experiments with the pure alkaloids isolated from the peyote cactus, the German chemist Arthur Hefter, he used this particular technique to determine the active molecule in the peyote cactus. So Hefter systematically ingested each of the 4 alkaloid fractions that are found in the visionary cacti separately, and when he experienced activity, he recorded its effects in his laboratory notebooks. And I just here have copied them from a paper where his notebooks have been quoted. So the paper is from Perrine, I believe it's pronounced, but Visions, the paper is called Visions of the Night, Western Medicine Meets Peyote, 1887, 1899. So this is what Hefter kind of recorded in his lab notebooks while he undertook this crucial self-experiment, which was performed on July 23rd, 1897. So he jots down the time, 12:09 p.m., where he consumes 1 gram of the sulfate salts of the alkaloids, corresponding to 16.67 grams of the drug. This was dissolved in water and it was taken orally. He records his pulse rate being 76 beats per minute. At 12:33 p.m., he notices in himself an occipital headache. He says limbs feel heavy. At 12:45 p.m., his pulse rate is 66 beats per minute. At 1 p.m., he starts to experience nausea. His pulse rate is at 60 beats per minute. At 1:15, the pulse rate at 60 beats per minute. And he says the following, and I quote him. He says, "While reading, green and violet spots appear on the paper. The same occurs when I look up at the bright sky. After shutting the eyes, visual images occur which are initially pale, but gradually become more clearly defined and brighter. In this particular experiment, landscapes are less frequent, and I have predominantly images of kaleidoscopic figures, patterned carpets and cloth, luxurious articles of clothing, and architectural scenes. The capacity for visual images lasts in this experiment for an extraordinary long time. Even on the following morning, colored green and violet spots still appear when I shut my eyes." End of quote. So by kind of assiduously self-experimenting, by observing as well as recording the effects that mescaline produced in his mind and body, Hefter was really able to determine that the compound mescaline hydrochloride was in fact the active principle of the peyote cacti, and that the molecule, and it was the molecule responsible for its dramatic visionary effects. Now, as a consequence of the successful deployment of the method, this experimental approach has been dubbed also the Hefter technique, and it became the main experimental method that was deployed by scientists studying the pharmacology and the phytochemistry of psychoactive drugs and plants. The Hefter technique has led to the discovery and the isolation of hundreds of psychoactive molecules, most spectacularly demonstrated in Albert Hofmann's serendipitous discovery of LSD-25. Hoffman also used the technique to determine that psilocybin and psilocin are the active principles of the sacred mushroom, Psilocybe mexicana, and that lysergic acetamides are the active molecules in the morning glory turbina corimbosa. Even outside so-called sanctioned academic, scientific, and corporate pharmaceutical research, this technique has been successfully deployed to identify the active principle of the visionary plant Salvia divinorum as being the novel molecule salvinorin A. So by emphasizing the self-experimental aspect of the bioassay, the Hefter technique is a way of acquiring knowledge, specifically of acquiring knowledge from drugs, and hence it stands as a fundamental method for the investigation of psychoactive and visionary compounds. Now, beyond its utility in isolating active ingredients, the psychonautical bioassay is also like a practical response to the problem of figuring out what a new psychoactive drug can do. Now, this is how the pharmacologist, chemist, and legendary psychonaut Alexander Shulgin approaches the task of drug discovery. And I quote him here from Pical. He says, "I take the compound myself. I test its physical effects in my own body, and I stay attentive to any mental effects which might be present." End of quote. So by using the psychonautical bioassay, Shulgin has obviously here synthesized hundreds of novel psychoactive chemicals, and he has determined their affects and capacities by progressively sampling them at different dosages and mapping how they change his embodied experience. So starting with very small sub-threshold doses, Shulgin kind of nibbles his way up to the higher ones, always in search of some type of activity. And once found, he studies the character of the drug by way of establishing thresholds of activity and the range of dosages that would consistently produce some type of psychoactive effect. So the self-experimental method here is totally tied to the production of knowledge. And the question would then be, what type of knowledge is this? And in this sense, we could totally say that the exploration of what I like to call pharmacoagnostic space, that this is really an endeavor that seeks knowledge from drugs. And here I really like what Dale Pendle has to say on this. According to Dale Pendle, he says, the pharmacognosy is the study of poisons and medicines. The emphasis on gnosis over logos connotes an experiential tradition based more on sampling and testing than on theory. Pharmacognosis, then, is poison knowledge, drug knowledge, in the sense of knowledge from drugs rather than of drugs. It is forbidden knowledge, but knowledge with the power to heal. End of quote. So the search for drug knowledge is kind of based on direct experiences rather than mere argument and logic, according to Pendle. It is a radically empirical endeavor. And this endeavor kind of submits the seeker of knowledge to some type of chemical ordeal that deranges the senses, that breaks conventions, and that totally blows the mind. Pharmacognosy, or drug knowledge, this is not like a royal science, but rather it is an itinerant, or what Gilles Deleuze calls a nomad science. What is meant by this is that it is a craft. It is some type of practical art form, kind of originally linked to folk medicine. And as an art form, it is more closely aligned with such things like alchemy, metallurgy, herbalism, and even sorcery. And in assuming this proximity, the production of drug knowledge is irreducibly linked to a chemical ordeal. A chemical ordeal that assumes the scientific guise of a modern self-experiment. Again, what we have called a psychonautical bioassay. So the reliance on this practical so-called like do-it-yourself method, this method differentiates the psychonautical pursuit from other forms of knowledge acquisition. What I mean by this is that by modifying our states of consciousness through chemical technologies, the psychonaut produces knowledge by experimenting on their own bodies and minds. And the underlying ethics of the psychonaut is essentially one where everyone is free to experiment with their own body and mind. So in kind of opening up the molecular realm to all who care to investigate, the psychonautic tradition is seemingly democratic, while at the same time demanding that the self-experimenter forego control of the experiment and that they undergo an ordeal, whose experience kind of amounts to some type of test, some type of protocol. In other words, the psychonautical bioassay kind of works to link direct experience to scientific as well as social experimentation. And here, visionary experience enters into relations with chemical, political, as well as economic forces. And at this juncture, like a number of links can totally be established between modern self-experimentation, psychoactive drugs, and most notably, a persecution. Consider here that experimentation pretty much stands as a practical way, as well as a material process that attempts to connect knowledge to experience. At its simplest level, experimentation is the activity of trying out something different. Etymologically here, the word experiment, which is derived from the Latin expedi, this word is totally ambiguous. It means both to experience as well as to test or to try. Also notice that in Latin, the term experiencia, this term means knowledge gained by repeated trials. We should also note that since the mid-14th century, the notion of to experiment, this pretty much meant to test or to observe through a trial. Should also notice the proximity of the terms experiment and experience. These two terms are totally and intimately entangled, so much so that the French word expérience means both experience and experiment. Additionally here, the old French word for experiment, which was espèrement, this word implies practical knowledge. It implies cunning, enchantment, magic, a magic spell. Now, in contradistinction, for the modern scientific method, an experiment is kind of generally understood as a tool used for deducing various types of general patterns of behavior from which theories might then be formulated. These theories can, in turn, be tested against well-designed protocols that might, in fact, falsify them or allow one to kind of select between different and competing theoretical interpretations. Should also note here that at least before the 16th century, none of this had anything to do with experiments. In the pre-scientific age, an experiment was just simply a way of interrogating the world and a way of demonstrating one's claims. And this mode of inquiry was seen by some as impiety, primarily because experimenters kind of dared to directly interrogate God's creation. Now, not simply content to accept the so-called word, the experimental drive actively engaged the forces of nature as well as the forces of creation. And this was a practice that was totally and closely tied to magic and the occult. So in this sense, at least before herbal craft and alchemy morphed into modern science, all medicines and remedies were pretty much thought to work according to so-called inexplainable, like occult virtues. Um, and through their effects, these substances pointed to powerful forces that were thought to be latent in nature and accessible to practitioners that followed what Dale Pendle calls the way of poisons. Now, from this perspective, drug experimentation, so psychonautics, is kind of tied to occult practices, primarily because these practices attempt to unleash the so-called hidden forces of nature. And in this sense, to experiment was to engage in a type of magic. It was to engage in a type of sorcery whose pursuit of knowledge was denounced as frivolous on the one hand and totally heretical on the other hand. So, for instance, according to the 13th century French philosopher William of Auvergne, magic, according to him, was what he called a passion for knowing unnecessary things. Now, the logic here is essentially that experiments do not lead one to true knowledge, but rather experiments only lead one astray. Now, this type of derision totally underscored like the intellectual climate at work in that particular time period. One which also considered such things like, curiosity to be a sin, or at least in the words of Saint Augustine, to be a lust of the eyes. In other words, with this kind of etymological relation, it seems that wandering is in fact dangerous. After all, was it not curiosity that led Adam astray in the garden? Was it not curiosity about the apple that, made everything go to hell here? So curiosity is seen as being something dangerous. But this type of curiosity is central to the psychonautic tradition. Hence, the experimental tradition of psychonautics is also and fundamentally a heretical tradition. And in this sense, drug knowledge is not only experimental and experiential, but more fundamentally, it is also a forbidden type of knowledge. This knowledge is dangerous, and it is dangerous because it arouses transformations. It arouses meanderings and becomings, and as a consequence, historically at least, it is no stranger to persecution. Again, I'm just simply kind of alluding here to the legalities around the use of psychedelic substances. And in this sense, if drug knowledge is a forbidden type of knowledge, then it is also a form of counter knowledge, and specifically a form of counter knowledge that produces new forms of resistance. Now, the powers that be may not let us experiment in peace, but this does not mean that resistance is futile. So I guess as I come to the end here, my parting message is that perhaps wandering in our minds can totally become, let's say, a new weapon in the age of living in a damaged planet. All right, everybody, that's all I have for you today. But I'm hoping that you guys want to talk about other stuff or extend some conversations here. But thank you guys for listening to my diatribe. And I hope I provided you guys with something.
Thank you so much for this, Ariel. Once again, this is a fantastic tour de force, as your lectures always are. Before I open it up to the floor, though, actually, I just wanted to ask you now, given sort of the whole sort of emphasis on the scientific method, and like we no longer mouth pipette in labs and so forth, like the whole idea of sort of self-experimentation has it like I don't is less prominent, let's say, and yet we're at a time right now where we're actually maybe some of those things need to be revisited. So your thoughts in terms of like what does the psychonaut of like this new millennium, what do they look like? What can they look like going forward, recognizing where we're at from a legal perspective as we today?
Yeah, great question, Heather. And that's totally what I kind of wanted to point at in this sense is like this, particularly in academic and scientific circles, the notion of self-experimentation is just fundamentally like this kind of forbidden type of knowledge. And this is where we have, kind of the popular notion of the psychonaut's dilemma. Should you talk about your own experiences if, you have self-experimented with these? But this is, kind of prototypically kind of translated as this is just mere subjective experience. It's not objective knowledge whatsoever. And this is what I'm alluding to in the sense of here we have a certain type of, like forbidden knowledge. This is a knowledge that is not so-called scientific, even though there's a long historical trajectory within science, modern science and medicine, of chemists, of psychopharmacologists, of using this type of method in order to extract some type of knowledge from drugs. And again, as Dale Pendle says, knowledge from drugs and not of drugs. And the distinction should totally be made here. So self-experimental knowledge, the acquisition of this type of knowledge is totally frowned upon in scientific circles. Again, what most people are interested in is kind of the classic gold standard of producing knowledge through clinical trials, where specifically the experimenters do not try the substances in question. So this is like this really, we see in the world of like, drug discovery, we start to see this new, so-called objective path open up. But in doing so, we also lose a whole bunch of the interesting aspects of drug discovery. And again, I'm talking about drug discovery in the sense of the psychonautic tradition, where in this tradition, the interest is not fundamentally in kind of discovering the medical utility of drugs, but rather in discovering knowledge from drugs. And I think it's that kind of discovery of that association with knowledge, not just, pragmatic knowledge, do psychedelics heal various types of mental conditions, but rather this other type of kind of philosophical knowledge. And I think that right there with the psychonautic tradition that has a deep kind of history of attempting to produce knowledge from drugs, i.e. pharmacoanalysis, that there is a possibility of kind of a resurgence of this type of knowledge, where subjective self-experimental knowledge also becomes not a forbidden type of knowledge.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for that, actually. Yeah, go ahead, Karen, jump in.
Thanks so much for your excellent talk, as always. Given on this topic of knowledge from drugs rather than knowledge of drugs, how do you relate that conversation to debates about whether psychedelic-induced mystical experiences are actually mystical experiences and can be analyzed or compared to other types of mystical experiences that are not occasioned via substances?
Yeah, excellent question, Karen. It is like a super huge debate that is occurring, has been occurring, kind of within psychedelic studies for quite a while. And for one, I totally see here that the kind of reliance on kind of like the mystical model has become a new kind of central trope in attempting to understand what these substances do. And that it has like totally galvanized an entire discourse where because of our, let's say, lack of imagination or lack of our attempt to kind of use language more creatively, that we then fall back on already kind of established models, which also show various types of problems in kind of configuring psychedelic experiences as being only mystical in nature. Particularly problematic, at least in my opinion, would be the hierarchization of various types of experiences, where the most important experience would be kind of the experience of the dissolution of the ego, which kind of fundamentally is linked to some type of metaphysical notion of oneness. And this totally puts into play kind of a colonial mindset, where other types of experiences, say experiences of plant teachers, where you do not produce, states of oneness, that these are deemed to be less important, or are kind of like way further down in, the hierarchical rung of mystical states of consciousness. And this is kind of like a colonial, I'll call it a colonial inheritance, an epistemological colonial inheritance of the centrality of the model of mystical states of consciousness. But at least in my view here, we need to start to produce newer vocabulary, because most of the vocabulary that we have to describe these types of states has now traditionally been coming from religious studies, particularly revolving around mystical experiences. This is also why I see the work of Dale Pendle as really going unrecognized, primarily because he totally attempts to create kind of like a poetics. His first book, Pharmacopoesis, totally argues this type of point. We just need to start to produce new types of vocabularies in order to describe the super strange experiences that are produced by these substances, particularly because these substances, as people argue, produce ineffable experiences. But in the production of these ineffable types of experiences, we also see a grand proliferation of people attempting to describe these experiences. So we have this like central paradox. The experiences are ineffable, but yet we see this graphomania, where people are writing about the experiences constantly. But because most people that are writing are not poets, then we fall back on a particular set of words and languages, which we kind of borrow from the mystical traditions, therefore kind of closing the possibility of producing a new type of knowledge by just reinscribing that knowledge in kind of a perennialist type of tradition. And I think there is that is kind of a dead end in a sense, because then we just relegate all of these states to just being interpreted in one way only. I hope I've answered your question, Karen.
Mm-hmm. Anybody else have more questions? Actually, what new words, what new vocabulary, Ariel, would you come up with? Would you want to use?
That's a super great question, and I think this is where like a collective would have to produce words together in their description of their kind of states of consciousness that are occasioned by these substances. But my basic point here is that an interjection of like linguistic creativity or poetic flair is kind of needed in the field in order to extend the way that we speak about these types of experiences.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I really love the fact that you often can identify when somebody is describing describing their experiences. Thinking of the doors of perception and flannel trousers. I will never look at flannel trousers again. Reed, go ahead.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Ariel, I'm going to ask you a bit of it's more of a speculative question, or I guess ask you to speculate a little bit here. I was thinking that what do you think is happening, or has happened, or is happening when this kind of assemblage that you were talking about of, you know, the Psychonauts, you know, the underground, their relationship with these like plant medicines, all that kind of meets this forefront with legalization of like kind of that scientific materials paradigm. And kind of what I'm getting at here is what would you speculate is going to happen to that assemblage? Like, will it be destroyed? Will it be transmuted? And perhaps where does wandering as a weapon, like you're saying, kind of come into that? I'm really curious to hear more about that.
If we conceive of like psychedelics as forming part of a particular type of assemblage, I totally see that the assemblage is undergoing drastic types of transformations because it's being connected to various types of new forces, you know, political economic forces, different types of mainstream groups, stock market, and a whole host of others. But in establishing new types of relations, and forming a new type of assemblage, then it just necessarily undergoes a super drastic transformation. So this is why I think the whole, you know, the study of psychedelics is so interesting right now, primarily because we're seeing a drastic, you know, transformation of the psychedelic assemblage as it enters into relations with a whole bunch of new types of entities and institutions. So we're seeing this drastic transformation, and that's why it's so interesting to like study psychedelics at this particular juncture. Like they're becoming something else as they enter into contact with all of these new forces and new players. Now, with regards to, you know, the the potential, you know, of resistance here, I think that's why it's important to, you know, talk about other ways of using these substances in other types of like communal, perhaps assemblages where they're not just kind of dictated by these larger types of institutions, and are not dictated by kind of research agendas that are only interested in the medicalizing processes. And this is why one of the reasons I wanted to kind of like just talk about the Psychonaut is because here you have a tradition that although the research can be used for a medicalizing process, but the point of the research is not fundamentally one about searching for medical drugs, but rather it is a tradition that is just speculative in the sense of like they're just interested in the production of drug knowledge, you know, knowledge from drugs, and it makes it more philosophical or a speculative tradition rather than kind of a tradition that is interested in converting old drugs into new medicines in that sense. And I think there is some type of, again, depending on the different types of relations that we could establish with the different types of you know, groups or entities or different types of bodies, other things are possible. But the transformation that we start to see is kind of like a mainstreaming transformation, and this is one of the reasons that, again, that it's interesting to be studying psychedelics at this particular juncture in history.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead, Louis.
Yeah, thank you, Ariel, for the wonderful presentation. I'm wondering, I wrote my question here. How do you see the relationship between psychonautic experiences and exploration, and then collective knowledge production within the scientific slash academic communities? And like, you know, and as an extension of that, do you think psychonautics would ever become an accepted or legitimate form of knowledge production?
To start with the second one, I think the psychonautics has been already historically a legitimate form of knowledge production. Some of the examples that I mentioned after Hoffman, they used the technique, the psychonautical bioassay, as a way to, you know, establish active molecules within you know, naturally occurring plants and fungi. They have used the technique to, you know, to advance scientific knowledge in that sense. And I totally see kind of, you know, following Mike J's book, who does a really good job of also kind of highlighting that the scientific and the philosophical and even the artistic kind of uses of drugs and the self-experimental use of drugs has always in one way or another kind of depended on a collective, a thought collective. And particularly during when psychedelics were made illicit, we totally see the emergence, particularly after the eruption of the digital space. We see the emergence of thought collectives, people coming together online in order to form some of the great online communities. DMT Nexus would be an example of here. Science does not function according to just the brilliant figures working in isolation. But science is a thought collective. And science progresses by putting information out there, having other peers read that information, debate those bases of knowledge. And it is only when that knowledge circulates and it becomes agreed upon that we start to, produce so-called scientific communities. But science is not the work of like one person or one brilliant scientist. Science has always been the work of like collectives. And I totally see that what I'm calling the psychonautic tradition is one such collective. And again, this is the beauty of various online communities where people can be in different places, but they're posting their trip reports. They're attempting to establish dialogues, debates. They're attempting to produce new tropes, new ways of understanding it. Again, my point being, just like science, the psychonautic tradition fundamentally functions through the basis of a collective experience. Again, by debating, by writing the stuff down, by people reading the trip reports, by comparing them, and by, again, establishing not individual types of thoughts, but in developing this thought collective in the same way that the scientific apparatus has developed, the dissemination of knowledge through the production of journals, which was a fundamental step in the birth of science. It was the establishment of journals and the circulation of ideas within these small communities that was the impetus for the emergence of modern science. Modern science is based on the collective generation of knowledge. And the journal, specific, specialized journals were the places where people could not just publish, but more importantly, where this knowledge was disseminated. It requires some type of community. It requires some type of thought collective in this sense. Cannot do this individually. That is kind of like my point. Particularly my point in emphasizing Jonathan Zott's idea of like, we psychonauts, which already implies this type of collective. This is the psychonaut may be an individual, by themselves, but they must be connected to some larger thought collective for their endeavors. To have any type of chance of accumulating some type of knowledge or producing some type of knowledge. I hope I kind of went a little bit of the way of answering your question, Louis.
Totally, yes. Thank you.
So, I'll go ahead, Nathan.
You can go ahead, Ed.
Yeah, no, that's all right. It's all good. You go, and I'll follow up.
Okay. I was gonna say too, I saw Yamina's hand earlier, so I don't want to. Did you have something to say, Yamina?
No, that's okay. But now that I have the microphone, Ariel, it's so nice to hear you speak again. Thank you so much for presentation. It's so captivating. Thank you.
No, it's great to see you, Yamina.
So I was wondering because I was kind of toying around with this idea recently, but since you were just talking about like the collective and then you mentioned the online communities, like I was trying to kind of analyze how anonymity plays a role specifically in the online communities and how that might sort of, I don't know, just change people's motivations, or like there's no personal gain when people are posting these things anonymously. But I was just kind of curious, like how you think that plays into the online communities, and what, obviously it was a necessity at first because people didn't want to get in legal trouble, but I think it has other implications.
Yeah, that's like a great question that you ask, Nathan. I think I think here, one thing I would say is with anonymity is, I think with anonymity here, we take the ego function out of the equation. If we're talking about the production of knowledge, does it matter who it comes from? If knowledge can or can stand up to the scrutiny of a thought collective, then it doesn't matter who it comes from in that sense. So perhaps anonymity is a positive here, as opposed to kind of the more standard way of doing it is like we associate some big name with some big idea, and then the reputation or the status of that name does a lot of the heavy work in kind of disseminating that idea, not necessarily on the basis of whether it's like a brilliant idea, but rather the idea is circulated and disseminated on the basis of the past reputation of the particular individual. Anonymity perhaps is good in a sense, because then it drives our attention not to the person producing the particular type of knowledge statement, but rather it drives our attention to the specific type of knowledge rather than the person producing it.
Thanks. Yeah, that totally makes sense.
So, on this area, like I think of, Richard Doyle in Darwin's Pharmacy does a really great job of describing two pieces. One is Watson and Crick's discovery of the DNA helix, the double helix, and how it came to James Watson during a psychedelic trip, like the structure, the double helix came to him during a trip. And he contrasts that with Kary Mullis and the invention of PCR, where, for Kary Mullis, it's not just like one trip, it's a series of it's a whole host of different trips where it actually, the idea of PCR never comes to him while on psychedelics, but the exposure to psychedelics allows him to sort of think down a different path. And I think of Oliver Sacks's use of psychedelics as well. And then the other one that I'm thinking of is I can't remember who did it, but the study that took a bunch of academics who had, I don't know, weren't able to get past a problem, and then gave them psychedelics to see if 6 months later or 12 months later or something, they were able to sort of get past whatever block it was that they had. So does it, in your assessment, I mean, those would be clearly psychonautical ventures, and have we potentially taken a medicalization tack in terms of what can these drugs do for us, as opposed to actually just going down that road and having more research done on actually solving problems, taking groups of people, whether they be scientists, whether they be, I don't know, pick your favorite group of folks who are trying to come up with some creative solution and using it for that. So that's my first question. Then the second question is sort of touching on Nathan's need to be anonymous piece, is that if people were actually honest in terms of their psychedelic use, I think of folks who work for labs where they're developing psychedelics, who none of their literature has their own personal use of psychedelics, but they for sure have lots of personal use of psychedelics on the side. And so is this potentially also a question of how willing to be totally upfront and honest we may be? Anyway, it's a two-parter. Tag, you're it.
Yeah. Well, I'll try and tackle both of them. I think for the first one, what I would say about that, what I would say is thinking always happens behind the thinker's back. What I mean by that is that for all of the examples that you brought forth, Carrie Mullis, Francis Crick, is because I really want to differentiate the idea that you don't just, drop a psychedelic and some brilliant idea just emerges in your mind from nothing. But here we have individuals that were actively working on a problem for a fairly long time, even with that other study that you mentioned. The people that were recruited to these studies, because I'm assuming you're referring to the Spring Grove kind of experiments on creativity. They recruited people that had been working on a problem and were unable to find solutions. So you already have a bunch of super engaged people that have been actively attempting to solve something. What the psychedelic here, what I would argue, what it does is it doesn't produce a new idea in the individual's mind, but it rather just allows them or it deterritorializes their way of thinking to a degree that a new type of configuration could emerge. And this is what I mean by thinking always happens behind the thinker's back. And I think that in terms of creativity, I think psychedelics kind of work like that. But you already need to have invested time and energy and brain power in the particular type of problem, that it is not just I drop acid and then some, paradigm shifting idea, pops into my head out of nothing. There's already something you have already been thinking, attempting to do something, attempting to solve something, but always hitting the brick wall. I think in those types of circumstances, that aspect of creativity can be fundamentally helpful with the use of psychedelics. But again, it is not the fact, I would argue, that a psychedelic could just produce a great idea in somebody that has not been hitting their head up against the wall attempting to solve something. And your second question, if you could just remind me.
Uh, I don't know, it slipped my mind while I was creating a third question. So following on this then, as I think the New York Times ran an article a number of months ago on psychedelics in the C-suite, about these retreats that are set up for CEOs and various leaders in business, specifically for this. I mean, in part there's a mental health and piece to it, but the other is how can you grow your business better? So clearly these are people that have invested lots of time, lots of money in building businesses and so forth. And so is that also considered being psychonauts, even if it tries sort of commercialization and capitalism?
I would say I would draw a distinction between I would say they're not psychonauts, because the purpose is to grow business or whatever else. But here the psychonautic tradition is a tradition that attempts to draw out knowledge from drugs about particular types of about that space, about that pharmacoagnostic space in that sense. I wouldn't necessarily connect that to growing one's business in that sense, but I do totally see the creative creative line, and I could totally see it being really lucrative in this sense of producing not just medical protocols, but producing, as you say, retreats where people are actively attempting to solve whatever individual, problems, whether they be business problems or other types of problems. I could see that being a totally lucrative line to go down as well. But I wouldn't necessarily connect that to a psychonautic tradition.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, different avenue entirely. Thank you so much to Yamina, who reminded me of the question, which was, in fact, it was about the anonymity piece, and in terms of like, how much or how many of us potentially are using psychedelics and potentially as psychonauts that are moving forward, but we're just not all putting it out there and being honest about it in the same way that, for obvious reasons, obviously.
Yeah, absolutely. This is what I mean again by, the notion that I was just trying to briefly point out, is this notion of like forbidden knowledge. We don't want to talk about that. We don't want to put that in the papers and so forth, because it's a certain type of forbidden knowledge. It's like subjective knowledge. It goes against kind of like the so-called objectivist tradition in science, and then there's still stigma attached to that. This is why I say psychonautic knowledge is like a forbidden type of knowledge. It is a poisonous type of knowledge because it's fundamentally a self-experimental type of knowledge. And by definition, self-experimental or subjective experiences are the exact opposite of objective knowledge. And again, here we find a dualism in our thinking here.
Thanks for that. Yeah. Go ahead, Yamina.
Okay. This is just to have to do, like, about historically, and I know that you're an anthropologist, you study anthropology. I'm just curious, like science, as I understand it, if I'm not mistaken, it's not just in psychedelics that this whole, or it's actually a question, the movement from like subjective sort of science to objective science, where that's, I'm going to use the word, maybe not harmful, but like in the world of psychedelics, it's kind of holding some places back. Is this true of other subject matters as well? Or would you say this is like typically of psychedelics, where your own experience is not, deemed scientific where it used to be? Is this basically like the model that science has followed in other scientific methods, or is it specific to psychedelics?
No, I would say that this is like a primary aspect of kind of modern, particularly positivistic science. This kind of dualistic division, which kind of has its point of origin in the Cartesian, the Cartesian dual universe, where you have res extensa, or the material thing, as Descartes called it, and the res cogitans, the thinking thing, and this dualism totally plays out in the scientific and in the medical fields, to the degree that we want to have, objective knowledge associated with the res extensa, knowledge about the extended thing, knowledge about the material world, and other disciplines, but not science, and not medicine, are kind of relegated to the so-called interior world, perhaps philosophy, most notably phenomenology, within the philosophical tradition. Various schools of psychology would also fall into that. But as we know full well, psychology and even psychiatry, some will argue, are still so-called pseudosciences because of their over-reliance on some type of subjectivist kind of bias. But I do see historically here that it's kind of the dualism that has separated, the objectivist from the subjectivist types of realms, that has played itself out, historically speaking, within positive science, and has totally hampered our kind of abilities to kind of conceive of a whole bunch of like central phenomena, where we still think of them as, particularly say, I'm particularly thinking here about the reduction of subjective experience to like a neurological mechanism. and all of the kind of debates and problems that arise from that. The reduction, say, of any type of subjective experience to being just like the consciousness is an epiphenomena of a matter. That this is at root an aspect of this kind of larger, philosophical tradition of dualism.
Thank you.
Yeah, jump in, Reed.
All right, thank you. Ariel, I was thinking about more about the development of the Psychonaut, and particularly thinking about that kind of 1971 where the big turn kind of happens and the clampdown comes down on all psychedelic use and research and consumption, and that there's this narrative that we enter into that dark age period for a while. But I was thinking, I was wondering if you might consider it to be actually potentially a positive catalyst for the Psychonaut, because it kind of ushered in this era of, at least what I think to be kind of self-education, where you have to really learn about, if you want to delve into these things, you need to learn about, botany or foraging or extraction. And I was wondering if perhaps that kind of by having those restrictions put on, if that actually may have led to a later blooming of the Psychonaut, because so many people had to self-educate and really go out of their way. Anyways, I'm just curious to hear your thoughts about that.
Yeah, I totally think that you're totally correct in going down that route. One of the things that we see totally happen during that particular historical period is now I'll say you had kind of a free for all, in the sense of people, although was totally and is totally illegal, this kind of going underground, what it did is then it democratized this type of exploration. So why I tried to call it the psychonautic tradition is kind of like a do-it-yourself tradition. In this sense, it's like a grassroots tradition. McKenna totally argued for that type of tradition. Anybody could do it. Think of the emergence of the Magic Mushroom Growers Guide. This is an attempt to democratize the mushroom. You don't need to buy from a company. You could grow it yourself, particularly in a day and age where these were illegal, mushrooms became illegal. But the guide is put out, and I believe the guide sold over 100,000 copies super quickly all over the world. But we could also imagine that all of those copies that were sold, many people started growing mushrooms and democratized it, as opposed to having a monopoly on psilocybin, getting it from a particular company and so forth. So there is this, although there is forbidden knowledge here, as I tried to allude in the talk, there's also democratizing process, a citizen science, as people in science and technology studies would call it. The psychonautic tradition is a precursor to citizen science to a great degree. And this is what we see. We go to a great website like Arrowhead as an example, have all these vaults of all these different drugs, but you also have trip reports, citizen science, people reporting on their self-experimentation, adding it to a vault of a whole bunch of other trip reports. This is just a grassroots citizen science approach, a do-it-yourself approach. The psychonautical tradition is a do-it-yourself tradition in this sense. And a do-it-yourself tradition, this is also why I called it a nomad science as opposed to a royal science. Like a royal science would be a science that is institutionalized, that has the big figures, that you go into it at a particular juncture and you have to meet certain types of steps. But a nomad science or an itinerant science is grassroots, doesn't have those types of institutions, and as a consequence, it is more democratic, but also perhaps dangerous, because there's always risk when we talk about these types of substances. They're powerful. So the psychonaut should also be a figure that approaches their protocols with caution. And this is why you start nibbling with very low doses and work your way up. Caution is also a fundamental part of experimentation.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
Yeah, go ahead, Nathan.
Yeah, I was just wondering, this is shifting gears a little bit, but I was thinking during this of David Casimir, who was here in November, I think. He was a patent lawyer, and he was talking about how it was somewhere in Europe that this company had filed a patent for a vaporizing device to use with dimethyltryptamine and 5-MeO-DMT that had kind of been lifted from knowledge that was produced by Psychonauts. It was like freely available on the internet. So I was just thinking, like, especially coming out of the 90s and the organization of these communities on the internet into the psychedelic renaissance, do you see any other ways in which like ideas from the Psychonaut community have been like co-opted by the more kind of like mainstream movements?
Totally, I think like a whole host of ideas have been co-opted by mainstream movements, for sure. The development of notions of set and setting would be like a prototypical example here. Psychonauts have been, toying around with different types of sets and settings, but now people are trying to like, patent particular types of settings. There's always some type of co-option. Again, in this kind of relationship between what I call the nomadic sciences, itinerant or like citizen science, to the more so-called royal sciences, I think there's always a movement of appropriation. And we not only see that with these kind of more scientific or medicalized spheres, but we fundamentally see that with indigenous communities. We fundamentally see that with, say, the sacred plant tradition and, practices of bioprospecting and biopiracy that have historically taken shape. Would even almost argue that the original, appropriation is obviously here, like colonialist appropriation of these plants, a practice that also continues to this day with the bigger, psychedelic companies that are starting to emerge.
And is it partially, do you think those types of knowledges are just more susceptible to being co-opted because they're like forbidden or collective knowledges, I guess?
I would say all knowledge is susceptible to being co-opted in that sense. And I would like kind of assume a position where there's multiple uses of things. There's multiple uses of ideas. There's multiple uses of tools. There's multiple uses of drugs, and they could all be co-opted in various types of directions. And again, here's where I see the importance of some type of, I like to call it a thought collective, and the proliferation of various types of thought collectives. Not everyone, not every group kind of working around the same project, but this kind of multiplicity, like a mode of multiplicity where, where there are different types of problems that, people interested, say, in psychedelics can be working on, not just one type of thing, not just, say like a medicalizing approach, but various types of different types of approaches, because there are different types of knowledges involved.
Cool, thanks.
Theft being the highest form of flattery. Do we have other questions actually from the floor or anybody from the YouTube channel too? Jump on in. This is your opportunity.
Nothing on YouTube so far, by the way.
Okay. Anybody else in the room have more questions for Ariel today? Yeah, go ahead, read it.
Hi, Ariel. Thanks so much. I guess in your talk, I was thinking about the first person experience in psychedelic therapist training and how it's placed as partly sort of a personal healing, but also having this experience so that you can be a better therapist, so that you can improve the safety and the efficacy of a treatment. And I'm wondering what you think about having that experience positioned in that way and sort of the limitations that might be inherent in this, the person self-experimenting, but there is a specific goal to become a better clinician.
Yeah, first of all, I totally think that someone that wants to, become, psychedelic assisted therapist should definitely have a few, experiences, so that they kind of know what the individual could possibly be going through. I think that should perhaps be a prerequisite to that type of role. Now, having said that, let me see, because there's a couple of ways I could attack this issue. Yeah, here I see that what you're talking about, it can totally be formalized in a sense of like would be totally possible to introduce first person experiences as part and parcel of like a bigger educational experience, particularly training experiences for psychedelic therapists. As an example, you could totally formalize self-experimental protocols, and in formalizing them, like again, as part of some larger training. And I think this would totally be beneficial because it would also, again, introduce a type of knowledge that you cannot get just from like an objective type of knowledge. By that, I mean like reading books, by listening to lectures. There is a type of knowledge, there's an experiential knowledge that the experiential knowledge cannot be derived from these other types of activities. And in this sense, I totally see that being not just beneficial, but I see it as being like kind of central to training people that are going to serve as facilitators. Yeah, without that type of subjective, experiential, direct knowledge, then training someone that doesn't have that, yeah, I think it becomes way more difficult here. I'm not sure if I totally answered your question, Bridget.
Yeah, but I love how you brought up again this subjective objective divide. I've been thinking about a lot about this, the division between the clinician and the patient, and the subjective objective divide that has been the objectification of research, of being an objective clinician, and how this type of training is very very threatening, I think, to the establishment of medical or nursing or even psychology training.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And, I'll get back to my point about this democratizing process, primarily because the production of knowledge is also the production of various types of forms of power. People that have particular types of knowledge then also have, the power to classify, particularly the power to classify between the normal and the pathological. There's a lot of power with regards to that type of classification. So setting up various types of boundaries on certain types of knowledge goes hand in hand with also, closing the possibility for a democratizing process. And institutions just fundamentally want to close that down. Absolutely. That's a great question you pose, Bridget.
Thanks so much.
Go ahead.
Just to follow up on Bridget's question, so then I wonder, because there's always arguments too, like of altered states and getting there with like through breath work or meditation, things like this. So then I was wondering how you feel about crossover of psychedelic experiences. Like, is somebody having a lot of experience, let's say with LSD, is there crossover in sitting for somebody with who's doing psilocybin, or do you feel they are quite specific in someone's capacity to move or support somebody moving through that?
Yeah, that's a great question, Yamina. I would say that at lower doses, I think the psychedelics are kind of similar in experientially, and that you start to really see like a lot of the major phenomenological differentiations as dosage increases in that sense. And again, depending on the psychedelic therapy and the dosage that is going to be used, I think at low dosages there might not be that kind of strict differentiation. Again, it would also depend on how you're kind of using the set and setting theory here. But at incredibly large, what McKenna called courageous dosage this is where you really start to see a lot of phenomenological differences. A high dose DMT experience is like really different than like a high dose MDMA experience, or even a high dose LSD experience. That's where you really start to see the phenomenological differences. So yeah, I think it kind of starts to become then a question of like an art of dosages in that sense.
Thanks.
So following on that, as one of the core faculty members of the MA program at the University of Ottawa, is the fieldwork requirement, as in one fieldwork requirement, adequate for the training that we're doing then? Or would you would you recommend approaching it in a different way?
I'm going to be really diplomatic to answer that question, Heather. You're like really putting me in a vice there. But just with regards to the length of the program only being like 3 semesters, and I think I'll say that if the program was longer, then there could totally perhaps hopefully be an opening for having more types of experiences with different substances. But the length of the program itself, and also being kind of one of the, if not the first program that allows students to take an experiential stance to this, one is good because of the length of the 1-year program. I'll just leave it at that.
Sorry for that. Thank you. Thanks for that, actually, especially given that there's a whole mixed bag of backgrounds that come to do that program. I totally appreciate that. Jeroen, I saw that you had your hand up there for a bit. You still have a question that will put Ariel in an even better vice.
Now, well, I was just pondering on, we've been talking a lot about knowledge hierarchies lately, and non can't even pronounce it. So there's this flat ontology and everything, and I was wondering, are hierarchies not just they're a given always in any type of situation, whether you're in mainstream or in subcultures or whatever. And I also suppose that we just cannot do without hierarchies. Not even the plant world probably. So I was wondering what your thoughts on that are.
Great question, Jeroen. I would say, yeah, absolutely. Hierarchies are inevitable. They're inevitable in social life. They're inevitable in the natural world, but they're fundamentally not inevitable at the ontological level. And when we talk about, say, a flat ontology, we're essentially talking at an ontological level. At the level of existence, at the level of being, there is no hierarchy, because all being speaks with one voice. So at the level of ontology, I think hierarchies produce problems. They produce problems at various levels, but hierarchies exist. They exist in the social realm, they exist in the natural realm. But again, I would argue that at the level of ontology, to produce an ontological hierarchy, say like the Great Chain of Being, I think that's problematic, and that it also contributes to, say, colonizing processes. It contributes to various forms of power, and it also contributes to transcendent types of ideas. So hierarchies are totally real, but again, it depends at what level we're talking. And if we're talking about ontologies, then I would fundamentally argue for flat ontologies. The level of ontologies, there should be no hierarchies, because being, with a capital B, is univocal. Being speaks with one voice. If we exist, if something exists, it exists, everything exists with one voice, in that sense. And again, at an ontological level. So I would draw that distinction in that sense.
I can totally relate to that, but I was thinking, if you're, for instance, in this psychonetic atmosphere, I would assume that there are sort of hierarchies, even against the perhaps the scientific knowledge, or well, not even, because there's a sort of scientific trend in the psychonautic world as well, I guess. My point is that even if you're in some sort of subculture or within indigenous peoples or something, they have their own hierarchies, also related to knowledges, not only in not only social hierarchies, but also related to knowledges. So this, even you as a person, you're in your inner being, your interbeing, you have your own hierarchies, because you just cannot live without it. There's hierarchy to being as well, to existing, to you need hierarchy to be able to live your life, to form your life. And that's related to
Sorry, I didn't get that last bit that you said it's related to
ontology.
There, I don't know. There, I would argue.
I can see your point the other way around. Being is being. Just being is being.
Being is being.
Yeah.
The other way I would argue this is, we're talking about hierarchy. I don't think that one of the things that you're trying to express here with that idea, that you're using the term hierarchy, but let me revert back to kind of like an idea that Spinoza has here. Spinoza produces the idea of substance. And according to Spinoza, there's substance. There's no differentiation here. Substance speaks with one voice. But he also attempts he also produces a moral system. And his ethics, his great book called The Ethics, one of the things that he kind of attempts to do here in the production of kind of his moral ideas is he kind of fundamentally starts to argue that we should evaluate things not in terms of good and evil, but rather in terms of good and bad. What is good for me extends my powers of existence. What is bad for me decreases my power of existence.
Mhm.
And here I don't have a hierarchy, but rather I have a kind of a pragmatic ethical system where I can make distinctions based on really situational or contingent factors that allow a being to make those distinctions based on a principle of extending one's power to act. What is good
Mhm.
is whatever extends my power to act. What is bad is whatever decreases my possibility of acting. So a poison is bad because it decreases or stops my power of acting. A medicine is perhaps good because it could increase my powers of acting. And again, I'm here basing this on the idea of the pharmacon. A pharmacon is both a medicine and a poison at once. It's indistinguishable. So how can we distinguish between them? Does it extend my powers of action? Or does it decrease them? Does it break down my body? Does it kill me? Or does it give me a fuller life? Does it extend my powers of action? And I think here, by arguing in this way, I totally get around the notion of hierarchy while still being able to determine different types of action through the notion of an extension to the power of acting. So it allows, again, it allows that the Spinoza's ontological system provides various types of arguments and mechanisms to get around the notion of hierarchy, while at the same time being able to make those types of distinctions. The difference between good and bad, always good and bad, according to the capacity to extend one's power to act or the capacity to decrease one's power of acting. I think that's how I would kind of answer that, Jerome.
Thanks.
Thanks so much for this. Actually, this is probably a really great great time, unless somebody has a burning question that they want to sneak in there. Probably a good time to wrap up, actually. So without any burning questions, Ariel, really thank you. These exchanges with you are always really awesome. So thank you so much for making time for this. We really appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Heather, and thank you guys for inviting me to talk. Always a pleasure to see all you guys. So I hope you got something out of my super kind of like brief and simple talk that I gave today. But thank you very much to all you guys.
Thank you, Ariel.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.